great to have everyone here today. My name is Nick Peterson, and I'm a professor of sociology and criminology at the University of Miami. I also serve as the director of the Master's in Criminology and Criminal Justice program. Most of my research focuses on racial disparities in courts, but I've had just a personal interest in psychology, mindfulness, and how those different principles can be used to improve society and reduce some of the biases that we're seeing in society here. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Chan, who is a neuropsychologist, a psychotherapist, and founder for the Center of Neuropsychology and Consciousness. He's an adjunct professor for the doctoral and master's program at Pepperdine University, and author of an award-winning book, Reassembling Models of Reality, published by Norton Press. Dr. Chan has also published a number of different articles and publications on topics such as mindfulness, trauma, creativity, and novel psychotherapeutic approaches. He also hosts a meditation group and has been practicing meditation with a focus on Zen and Daoism for many years now. As an aside, he has a lot of educational programs online, including Instagram, where he has over about 20,000 followers at dr.chan, as well as a podcast focusing on some of these various issues. And these are just a small list of his various accomplishments. And on a personal level, I'm happy to know him as a amazing friend, amazing human. We've been close for about a decade now, since we both moved here about the same time to Miami. It's just been a great pleasure watching him grow in terms of his research, teaching, private practice. And over the years, we've talked about a lot of the different principles that come up in this book. So it's a great honor here today to introduce his book, 7 Principles of Nature, How We Strayed and How We Return. Let's start with the first part, SAD, or separation, alienation, and discord. So I was particularly interested in this part of it because there's actually some classic sociological texts that deal with this particular issue, obviously from a different frame of reference. But so, for example, Durkheim, famous sociologist, talks about how there are variations, structural variations in terms of rates of suicide across countries, and talked about how different levels of alienation related to that. Also, Karl Marx, for example, talked about how the formalization of capitalist society leads to alienation and a separation from what we produce and nature. And so some of those things really struck me in terms of not only being relevant to psychology, but to sociology, to a lot of other different fields. And so I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on this idea of alienation and separation.
So the separation phase is related to neuropsychological functioning. At some point in our evolutionary history, we developed the ability for symbolic thinking, for our experience of self and understanding others. And this relates to a network in the brain called the default mode network. The acronym I give it is the MOTS network, for mental time travel, others, and the self. It probably developed around 50,000 years ago or so. That's the first evidence that we find of cave paintings, of body adornment, of ritualistic burials and such that might suggest the experience of this. And so what is the support for having a network in the brain that allows you to suspend the immediacy of space-time? Well, it's to allow us to plan, to better analyze, and basically think before we act, right? Which was probably very useful for the flourishing and survival of humankind. I guess I'll throw in one more here. This is an important one. The central executive network, it's involved with goal-directed action and thinking. And so when we're, holding items in mind and manipulating them in your working memory, that's all that central executive network. So both of these networks basically allow us to override the immediacy of space and time. And to relate this to your own experience, I ask on any of you, how many of you have ever had the experience where you suddenly drifted off into reverie or into a daydream? Right? A bunch of us. Yeah? Yeah. And when that is happening, that's your default mode network that's active. And what happened? You separated from what's actually happening in the present and you went into your mind. So that's what I mean by saying we suspend the immediacy of space-time. And then the alienation portion This moves into more historical ideas as well as modern day practices. So this sort of goes back to mismatch theory in evolution. Mismatch theory in evolution is most simply, it's the idea that our modern day life, our modern day way of living is incompatible with the conditions that we used to live in, the conditions that we really evolved for. Because up to 99% of our human species, our history has been spent as hunter-gatherers, small band hunter-gatherers, up to 50 people. And their lifestyle was very different from the way that we're living now. This is just 1% of humankind. And so there's this extreme change. And of course, rapid changes in these sorts of conditions can very much threaten our existence and lead to all sorts of challenges, right? So just as a quick example of how this might relate to the modern day world and current issues and discussions, the diagnosis of ADHD, right? It's something that everyone is very familiar with. Some people think it's made up. It's definitely not made up. But one way to think of it from this perspective is that it was a result of a mismatch. Because as I tell my students, who do you think invented fire? Who do you think started fire, started deciding to rub sticks together? It was probably the person with ADHD. The person with ADHD is probably well suited for an unpredictable environment. But the way that modern day is and the way that things are structured, it's very difficult for some people with that development and those acquired traits to excel and flourish in a world that's structured and bureaucratic and has all these systems and so forth, right? So that's an example of that. The agricultural revolution, circa 10,000 BCE, was a very significant historical event because it led to sedentary living, right? And sedentary living led to the expansion of populations. Expansion of populations leads to competition. It leads to people jockeying for positions. It leads to hierarchies. It leads to government regulation. Because back in the day, right, when we were up to 50 people in a tribe, if there was major conflict, everyone just comes together and resolves the conflict. But that obviously becomes unreasonable as soon as it expands to like 1,000 people or 2,000 people. And so there has to be these sorts of structures that come to rise. There's also the increased stress. There's differences in parenting. There's lots of allo-parenting. That's very much involved when it comes to the hunter-gatherers. In fact, when you look at one of them, the statistic is that 60% of the time a child spends their time with other parents as opposed to their core parents, which is astounding. Today, if you are a parent, you know, it's pretty difficult to have this giant burden or expectation to take care of your children on your own. It's very easy to burn out. Allo-parents are extremely important for our development and evolution. And it's also beneficial for many ways, right? Because if a child has, let's be honest, if they have terrible parents, right? Well, they have other good parents that may be able to thwart a poor attachment, right? And poor attachments, unfortunately, lead to lots of relational issues and, well, they end up in my office. So I guess it's good for me, but in essence, it's bad for the community, right? So these are just a bunch of different little examples here and there, right, of how the differences and how mismatch can play a role and how we become more and more alienated with the conditions that we originally evolved for versus what we're living in today. Happy? I'll throw one more, brief one. Movement, right? Hunter-gatherers, the Hadza, for example, if you average out males and females between 18 to 75, they're averaging about 14,500 steps a day. The average American, well, average out females and males, and it's about 4,500 steps a day. And so there's a giant difference there. And so, you know, I'm not saying that we should become hunter-gatherers again. Some people suggest that. I don't. I think we need to find a way to preserve what's valuable and things that we can learn from their culture, but also be able to live in the world we live in today. So an example of that would be 7,000 to 10,000 steps a day. That's something that is in between and also found scientifically to optimize your health benefits. So that's, you know, other examples. There's a whole table actually of hunter-gatherers, lifestyle and modern day lifestyle, how they're incongruent, and then suggestions of how we can improve. So that's the alienation portion. Finally, the Discord portion, I'll spend less time on this. I'm talking too much. But the Discord portion basically involves belief systems, how our belief systems are now changed. They're not just alienated, but now in discord. So we are actually in conflict with these principles. And one idea is the idea of dualism, the idea that mind and body are separate. Lots of people who think about mind and body as separate, or soul and body as completely distinct entities, they will start putting all the positive things in their life and their virtues completely onto the mind or the soul. And then everything that they don't like about themselves gets thrown onto their body, into their biology, right? This creates a rift. It creates a fragmentation between a body that you have to live in through this life, as well as your thoughts about it. And so this leads to, it's literally a perfect equation that will lead to perpetual conflict. Because if you have to live in your body, but you think your body is the reason for your lust or your gluttony or your greed or whatever the case is, then you're always going to be in conflict with yourself. And the truth is that when we look at the scientific literature today, there is so much evidence to support that our bodies are extremely intelligent, especially, lots of talk about our gut brain, our heart brain, and of course our brain, and everything is embodied and connected. And so when we start thinking about ourselves in that way, we start living healthier lifestyles, and we're able to move forward from this sort of self-hatred that can really pull us down. So that's the sad theory in a nutshell. There's a lot more in the book, and I'm sure I could go on for ages, but I'll give it to Nick for other questions or thoughts.
Yeah. We don't necessarily have time to go through every single thing that's in the, all 7 principles that are in the book. Obviously, you expand upon those. But can you talk a little bit about some key principles, maybe 1 or 2, and maybe some practical examples, kind of like what you did with, you talked about maybe more exercise, things like that people can really latch onto and try to use in their day-to-day lives?
Yeah. Okay. So first I will share with you that the 7 principles, I came up with this great acronym. It's CPR West, because that's exactly what the aim of this book is for, CPR West. So we have creativity, we have process, we have relationship, we have wholeness, we have equilibrium, we have spontaneity, and we have transformation. And those are the 7 principles in a nutshell. And each one of these principles, we could think of them as an invitation for each and every one of us to engage in a particular way of being. And so if we are aligned with these natural principles, it will enhance our potency in the classical Taoist words. So as an example, let's talk about creativity. Creativity can have many different definitions. The way I think about or talk about creativity in the book, well, we could think of it, number 1, as nature creating itself, right? And it's in this perpetual process and action of creating itself. It's really crazy to think about, because at the edge of every created moment is nothingness. It's just pure nothingness. I guess it depends on your belief system, but if you follow science and so forth, so we're always at the edge of nothingness and something, which is, I think it's really cool to think about. In any case, so that's one part of it. Everything is in continual creation. But it's not just creating monotony, right? It's this explosion of diversity, of amazing, beautiful living forms and living systems. And so what does that tell us in regards to how we might be able to live our lives? What does it tell us about our being? And so one of the main things is for us to be more open and accepting of change. Change can be considered 2 things. One, it can be considered a precondition for balance, right? So if we think about homeostasis, like every time we are hungry or something is off kilter, right? We go get food and then we return back to balance. That's homeostasis, right? The way creativity acts is through change. Things continue to change. One of the things that all of us face is a fear of uncertainty, or at least lots of my clients face, I'm sure. It's a universal condition that uncertainty leads us to feel fearful, right? In some way. So when we are confronted with uncertainty, what happens in our brain? Well, we have this little area called the amygdala and the limbic system involved with fight or flight that becomes very active and alerts us. And then our frontal lobes are engaged in threat detection or threat assessment, right? And so this is one way we could engage with uncertainty. And unfortunately, that's not a very productive way to engage with uncertainty. So what I suggest in the book is to engage with uncertainty from a different perspective. One is to adopt an intentional uncertain perspective or a state of unknowing. And what I mean by that is to, yes, be open and accept, but to approach uncertain situations from the orientation of discovery, as opposed to an attempt to find a goal. And when you do that, when you approach it from this discovery perspective, you're no longer latching onto expectations, but you are in the present and you're taking in information as if it's just information and energy, as opposed to something that will lead you to feel dysregulated. And what we find in the literature in science is that when you do take this sort of approach, some people think of it as an experimental approach. You're just acquiring data, and data is not going to make you feel bad or good necessarily. You find that the amygdala reduces in its activation, that the frontal lobes also change in their activation, and we improve their connection and in conversation through the thalamus, which is the brain's relay station, and ultimately it leads to individuals feeling less anxious. So that would be the example of like the science side. The classical Taoist side, there's a really fun, great parable that's quite popular, so some of you may have heard it. I'll share with you the actual version of it, because there's like a westernized version of it from this book called the Huainanzi, which is basically like I'm sure many of you have heard of Marcus Aurelius and his meditations. The Huainanzi is also like a guide to being like the perfect emperor, but from ancient China, and it's like a tomb that's like this big. In any case, this story comes from that book, and the story begins with a famous family of diviners. So they can do a very good job predicting the future. And this family of diviners are also farmers, and they have animals and horses and pigs and all sorts of things. And one of the things that happens is that their most beautiful prized horse ends up running away. And then everyone from the village decides to come by and express their sympathies. We're so sorry that this happened. And the father diviner was like, well, this is very fortunate. This is very, very fortunate. The villagers left confused, like, that's strange, this is definitely not fortunate, and so they leave. A few months later, the horse comes back with 5 to 10 other horses. And now they have, well, more horses. And then the villagers come by and they express how excited they are and how happy they are, right? And the father diviner says, oh no, this is unfortunate, this is not good, this is not good. The villagers left again, very confused. The father's son decides to train one of these wild horses that arrives and gets thrown off the horse and breaks his leg. The villagers came in and they said, oh my God, this is so bad. What can we do to help you out? But then the father said, no, this is very fortunate. This is very fortunate. And then a month later, the Chinese army comes in and they try to recruit the son, but the son has a broken leg. And so they decide, well, we're not going to recruit him. And they find out that the battle that son would have gone to, 9 out of 10 people died. And so the villagers came by and said, that's amazing, your son is so fortunate that this happened. And what does the father say? No, this is unfortunate, right? So this is how I'm sort of bridge the gap with the science and the parables. And I think that would be my response to that question.
Okay. Great. Yeah, and you give a lot of other practical tips. There's different meditation guides in there, other exercises and things that you can do. So I have some other questions that I can ask, but I think, we've been talking for a little bit. Maybe let's open it up to see if anyone else has questions about... Yeah, go ahead.
Of course, Gregory has a question. Hard question, probably.
Hopefully not. Actually, on that, for the alienation part, how symbolic thinking leads to this ability to retreat into your head and not be present. And then next, you talked about how the way society is constructed. Do you feel like those two are related? Like the way that we got the ability to not be present and the way we construct our society?
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. So this is what I would say, that to go back one phase, actually, the separation phase is not necessarily a bad thing, right? Because we can be separated, but we can be in harmony with that which we separated. So if we think about a musician, right? If we think about musicians, and musicians are all playing together, they can be playing in harmony. But then, someone might play a bad chord or a bad note, which is probably me among the bunch. Yeah. And all of a sudden everyone gets thrown off, right? And if that's the case, that's where we lead more towards alienation and discord. But I think the first thing to say is that symbolic thinking, the ability to suspend immediacy of space-time, doesn't need to be a bad thing. In fact, I think it could enhance creativity and even improve the depth of which we are connected with nature. Because I see, at least, and I think of our ability to think and the space within our minds to be a deeper layer of nature that we were capable of grasping. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
If we felt and realized that our ability to think could give us a deeper connection to nature, why do you think we didn't go in a direction that was more in line with nature as opposed to?
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think even to relate it more to the present, we simply didn't know what the consequences would be. We didn't know that creating these sedentary settlements would lead to greater spread of disease, or that it would lead to malnutrition, right? Or less movement and mobility. Like, all of these things were not expected. And I think the same thing is happening now actually with technology, right? Now we're finding all sorts of difficulties in the younger generations, especially in regards to their social skills and all sorts of other skills. And so I think it really goes back to that at the end of the day. Yeah. Because I mean, one of the forces of evolution that we don't tend to think about, other than, the need to survive, is actually conservation of energy. That's a big one that lots of people forget about. And so in this particular circumstance, we developed farming and all these great agricultural tools, and it's like, yes, conservation of energy, but at the end of the day, it also led to repercussions that we weren't able to understand. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. One more thing let me throw out, actually, it's to your point. There is this adaptive lag, but we also have neuroplasticity. And it's not just neuroplasticity that our brains can change, but we also have what's called phenotypic plasticity. The expression of our genes can also change. So these two are very, very important to consider, because it's not like we're rigid mechanical, motors. And actually, my own field has become detached from nature. A lot of people in my field compare brains to computers, right? I'm sure many of you have heard this. They say, oh, well, the hardware is the brain and the software was the mind.
Artificial intelligence.
Artificial intelligence, sure, artificial intelligence, yeah. But to me, that's just so far from the truth, because when we think about how much energy is actually used in the brain, it's about 12 to 20 watts, which is enough to light a 20-watt light bulb, right? Whereas I think it's called Project Blue Brain, basically estimated that if you were to create a supercomputer that would hypothetically do everything that our brain can do, it would require 20 gigawatts, which is billions of watts, which, to put it into perspective, is enough to light up 15 million average American homes. So it's so energy efficient, and there's so much going on in our brains that I don't think it's fair at all. In fact, it's dehumanizing to compare the capacity of our brains to a computer.
Good place to end, I think, because we're about 8:30. So,
Okay.
We'll go ahead and give Dr. Chan. And then if anyone...
Thank you.